So welcome. I'm Barbara Lee Van Horsen. I am the experimenter at the Momentum Center, which is a grassroots movement to create a stigma-free community. And we do that by operating the Momentum Center for Social Engagement and by facilitating community conversations on social justice and human rights, and by leading cultural immersion experiences. 2 years ago, we convened the Anti-Racism Task Force, and then spent the last 2 years having virtual town hall meetings on race and racism. Over that same 2-year period of time, we stopped our international cultural immersion experiences because of COVID. And then we realized that we really didn't have to leave the country to experience the world through a completely different perspective. So those two initiatives, the Anti-Racism Task Force and the cultural immersion trips, came together in the Civil Rights Road Trip, which was meticulously planned with the skills of Jane Stoker and Daryl Fisher. You'll be hearing from both of those ladies tonight. And it was not a vacation. It was not a mission trip. It was a way of being immersed and another way of living and being. So on Monday, April 18th, 40 of us boarded a bus for what would turn out to be a truly transformational experience. Some of those people are here to share that experience tonight. Jane and Daryl, that I mentioned, plus Carrie Hample, Betsy Jellema, Carrie Corpy, and Cindy Anderson. But I see there's a number of other people who are on the trip who are here. So if you were on the Civil Rights Road Trip, would you stand up for just a moment? And let people see who you are. So we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers with our presenters after the presentations, but you also have a look at other folks that you might want to approach and get their feedback as well. The Civil Rights Road Trip offered an opportunity to be genuinely uncomfortable. I don't mean just because of the bus. We journeyed into the South to be confronted with painful truths about this nation's history and to admit the painful truths are still part of our society today. I'm not going to go over the itinerary because our presenters will provide that, as each of them walks us through a different leg of our 4-day intensive journey. During each of those days, we took time to reflect together on what we were experiencing and how it was impacting us. And so we're here today to bear witness to that pilgrimage and to share with you how we have been changed. So before our pilgrims begin, I want to share with you one of our reflections. These were words from Martin Luther King in 1967. Being a Negro in America is not a comfortable existence. It means being part of the company of the bruised, the battered, the scarred, and the defeated. Being a Negro in America means trying to smile when you want to cry. It means trying to hold on to physical life amid psychological death. It means the pain of watching your children grow up with clouds of inferiority in their mental skies. It means having your legs cut off and then being condemned for being a cripple. It means seeing your mother and father spiritually murdered by the slings and arrows of daily exploitation, and then being hated for being an orphan. Being a Negro in America means being harried by day and haunted by night, by a nagging sense of nobodiness, and constantly fighting to be saved from the poison of bitterness. It means the ache and anguish of living in so many situations where hopes unborn have died. Now I'd like to welcome Jane Stoker to take you through the first day of our Civil Rights Road Trip. And I forgot to show the picture of our whole group. You'll want to use this. Right?
I'm gonna multitask.
Okay, just put up your name.
Good evening, and thank you for being here.
In preparing for this trip, I had begun my own personal journey and educated myself about racial injustice through books, podcasts, movies, and articles. I attended the Momentum Center Town Hall on Racism and joined the Momentum Center Anti-Racism Task Force and joined in some other Zoom meetings of various organizations over the years. I was getting my own grip on a history of racial injustice that I clearly did not get in my K through 12 education, as well as my undergrad or master's program. As I prepared for this trip, I was really not sure what to expect. I felt like I was beginning to process new information on an intellectual level, but what hadn't revealed itself to me yet was the impact it was going to have on an emotional level. Getting on the bus held some anxiety for me, but there was also an intrigue for adventure. As we filed on the bus leaving a very chilly Grand Haven morning, we began our journey with our first stop being Birmingham, Alabama, to visit the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, whose mission states is to enlighten each generation on civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future. The bus became for me very symbolic of those during the civil rights movement who had to take a bus or were told to get to the back of the bus or were carried off of the bus because of the color of their skin. There were times my legs needed to stretch, my hips were stiff, and I couldn't get comfortable. But never once did I feel like I didn't belong on that bus or was going to be threatened, pulled over crossing state borders that didn't want me there, or beaten because I was on the bus. It was also symbolic of the time in the spring and summer of 1961, 436 people, old and young, black and white, northern and southern, came together to travel in small groups through the Deep South, defying Jim Crow laws and putting their beliefs, even their very lives, on the line in defense of racial justice. The Freedom Riders expanded the realm of the possible in American politics, redefining the limits of the dissent and setting the stage for the dramatic events of the 1960s, all by taking a ride on a bus. We arrived at the historic Tutwiler Hotel in downtown Birmingham after a dinner stop in Nashville 3.5 hours prior. Arriving around 9:30 p.m., we were all grateful to stretch and get in a comfortable bed. After our morning reflections, we were able to take in the amazing photography collection in the halls of the Tutwiler Hotel. My heart education had begun. With a little time before we were going to the museum, I walked with my sister down the main street in beautiful downtown Birmingham. Along the way, there were markers that told the story of the Birmingham March in May of 1963. More than 1,000 African-American students attempted to peacefully march in protest of Birmingham's segregation system. They were hosed down and arrested. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and while imprisoned wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail, which is one of the suggested readings on our resource list before we left for this trip, whose main themes include justice, civil disobedience, and Christianity. King argues that denying justice to one person threatens justice for everyone. I encourage you to read the whole letter. As we all continued our walk to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, we entered a sculpture park before the museum. Walking through this park began to set the stage even more on the events that took place during the historic Birmingham March, as well as capturing the fear that Black Americans were faced with when peacefully protesting the injustice that they were living in. Walking through the sculpture with the dogs on either side was, to simply say, terrifying. The dogs were placed at the level of our heads as we walked through. Their expression was fierce and intimidating, exactly what was supposed to happen. There was no sound, but I could imagine the horrific barking and growling that accompanied that situation. The sculpture with the police and dogs was no less disturbing. My heart began breaking. As we continued through the park, the Civil Rights Institute was ahead of us, but across the street from the museum stands the historic 16th Avenue Church. This church was where 14-year-old Carol Rosamond Robertson, 14-year-old Cynthia Dion Wesley, 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, and 11-year-old Carol Denise McNair were killed by a bomb by the Ku Klux Klan before the Sunday service. The 16th Street Baptist Church hosted several meetings led by civil rights activists. In an effort to intimidate demonstrators, members of the KKK routinely telephoned the church with bomb threats intended to disrupt these meetings, as well as regular church services. They followed through with their threats and killed these 4 innocent children. Angela Davis, professor emerita at University of California, Santa Cruz, grew up in Birmingham and spoke at a 50th anniversary event in Oakland. Here are excerpts from her talk. Remembering and paying tribute to this tragic event, let us not pretend that we are simultaneously celebrating the end of racist violence and the triumph of democracy. Let us also not labor under the illusion that this church founding was an anomaly. We know that Robert Champus, who was eventually convicted of carrying out the bombing, along with 3 others, we know that he had been responsible for bombing Black homes and churches over so many years. As a matter of fact, during the 8 years prior to the church bombing, there had been 21 bombings in Birmingham. This man's nickname was Dynamite Bob. He was known in white communities, talking about terrorism. And I want to emphasize the importance of understanding how much terrorism, racist terrorism, has shaped the history of this country. And there are lessons we need to learn from that. My heart continued to break. We walked over to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and were greeted by a guard that gave us information on our tour. The journey continued. Walking through the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute began a whole new type of education with the stories, displays, and sounds that began putting names, faces, and a reality on the civil rights movement. At times, I didn't want to look or hear or read the information that was throughout the museum because the reality of the injustice was becoming clearer and heavier on my heart with each room I entered. However, I felt a strong sense of responsibility to learn and feel more. It was time for my heart, as broken as it was feeling, to face this harsh treatment and reality that happened. And it's still happening today to my brothers and sisters of the human race. I know after visiting this place, there was far more ahead and no way for me to turn back. There was no more denial or privilege or choosing to only hear what I chose to hear. It was time to feel. I will now turn the next portion of the program over to Terry, who will continue our journey for you. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you hear me better?
No. Sorry.
I'm just going to start out with a little bit of history. Although I traveled across the South, and I actually spent 2.5 years in Georgia in the late 70s, it wasn't until I stepped off our bus in Alabama that I was struck with my own naivete about the struggle for freedom and civil rights that thousands of human heroes and otherwise faced and endured. Not to minimize what was happening in many other cities across the United States, but Selma was a staging place, not only for the struggle for civil rights in our country, but became for me the launch of an emotional learning curve that I've never experienced before, and I will be processing for years to come. History class in high school fairly touched on Dr. Martin Luther King and his struggles, and we all know how he rallied many followers on the historic march from Selma to Montgomery in the face of violent opposition, an event that became a milestone victory for the civil rights movement. But MLK was murdered in April of 1968, about a month before I was to graduate. And unfortunately, I didn't follow much history for the next 30 years. Although we did not have time to see much of the city of Selma, I began researching the history of Selma on my return home And I found myself awestruck by the tenacity, the bravery, and the fortitude of the people there who took on the struggle for civil rights. A little history is important to refresh all of our memories. So Selma, since before the Civil War, had been a seat of manufacturing and transportation and a target for Union strategists. Successful and failed attempts were made on the city during the Civil War until finally in 1865, Selma fell to the Union under General Wilson's cavalry in what was called then the Battle of Selma. The munition supply and the naval foundry were badly crippled then, but the city began the rebuilding process and quickly reemerged as a center for political power in Alabama. Notable since the Civil War were, number one, the election of Alabama's first African-American to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1870. Born a slave, Benjamin Turner was, upon his emancipation, one of the wealthiest men in Alabama. In 1865, he helped establish the first school in Selma for African-American children, and among many achievements in Congress was noted for obtaining federal funds to repair war-damaged buildings, including a federal building in Selma. Feminist that I am, I found my focus shifting in Selma to the women, often those behind the men of the movement. So I had to do some research. Suffrage for women in Alabama began in Selma early in the 20th century. An organization of women from Birmingham and Selma that combined their resources held a statewide convention in 1913 at the Hotel Albert in Selma. It resulted in the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. Women were granted the right to vote in 1920, and Tennessee became the 36th state to approve the 19th Amendment. Dallas County women embraced these newfound rights and in 1922 elected one of their own, Hattie Hooker Wilkins, as the first woman to serve in the Alabama House of Representatives. How many of us knew that? In World War II, Selma's reputation as an arsenal of the Confederacy changed to become an arsenal of democracy with the installation of the largest flying field in the United States. It became a training center for pilots and handlers of pursuit planes. Craig Field, it was called, was the new site for training in many technical aspects of Air Force work, and the facility built a reputation for innovation and pioneering, which it carries on to this day. In 1950, African Americans made up about 1/2 of Dallas's county voting age population, but since 1901 had been denied the right to vote through poll taxes and literacy tests, which were required by its state constitution. Women of Selma became leaders in the civil rights marches, including the Selma to Montgomery March, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, that began with Bloody Sunday at the Pettus Bridge. These included a fearless woman named Annie Lee Cooper, who joined with other women in many attempts to become registered voters. In 1963, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, organized Freedom Day with her help that brought 400 Black potential voters to the Dallas County Courthouse to register. Beaten by the racist sheriff, Jim Clark, she lived more than 100 years, and a sidelight, if you've seen the movie Selma, which just came out about a year ago, that's Cooper, was played by Oprah Winfrey after Cooper told Oprah Winfrey that she had spent most of her adult life watching Oprah on TV, accompanied by her tuna fish sandwiches. So Oprah agreed to play the part. The very vibrant church community in Selma and Dallas County became an organizing launching pad for most of the civil rights actions during the 60s. Marchers who were injured on Bloody Sunday in 1965 would be treated at the Tabernacle Baptist Church's basement on Broad Street. This became one of the vital helps for foot soldiers throughout the movement. These churches were the foundation for national organizers long before the Bloody Sunday March across the Pettus Bridge. This is the Pettus Bridge, in case you haven't recognized it. The Dallas County Voters League had been working to add African Americans to the voter roll since the late 50s and offered voter registration classes to the community. One of the teachers there who taught classes was a woman named Marie Foster, who became known as a mother of the voting rights movement. In the 60s, she, along with Amelia Boynton Robinson, became one of the only women to hold a leadership position in the Dallas County Voters League. And they acted together as a bridge between other organizations like SNCC, the Southern Conflict Leadership Conference, and the Congress on Racial Equality. In 1965, Selma was the stage for the climax of the struggle to extend the vote to all Americans. Nonviolent protests to demand equal rights under the law required courage, determination, and resistance. People of Selma displayed that, and that they came to inspire confrontations with oppressors around the world in struggles for the same kind of equal rights. Another leader in the Dallas County voters, Marie Foster, lent her home to Dr. King in 1964 when it was time to draw the movement's attention to voting rights, to what was already happening in Selma. She marched to fund the crowd on Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965. She and other foot soldiers were met with brutal acts of police violence that day. Foster was clubbed, but was back 2 days later to organize the Selma to Montgomery March, which reached Montgomery after 3 days with safe stops to eat and sleep in private citizens' front yards. The marchers were protected by National Guardsmen and orders from Lyndon Johnson that limited the actual number of marchers to 300 to protect their safety. 54 miles later, they were joined at Montgomery's Capitol building by a crowd of 50,000 black and white supporters. Pretty profound. And about 300 people, maybe 50,000 supporters in Montgomery. August 6th of that year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the right to vote, first awarded by the 15th Amendment to all African Americans. 7,000 voters were registered in Dallas County. Specifically, the act banned literacy tests as a requirement for voting. It mandated federal oversight of voter registration in areas where tests had previously been used, and gave the U.S. Attorney General the duty of challenging the use of poll taxes for state and local elections. On April 20th of this year, our group walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I did not visit the Voting Rights Museum and Institute on the other side of the bridge, but I crossed the street and visited the Selma Voting Rights Monument and Park, which I learned was built by the people of Selma. Here I saw some incredible monuments, and I gotta say, these were profound to me and really sparked this incredible emotional journey that I embarked on. My first glance was at this symbolic, loving monument to Martin Luther King Jr. and his linked wife, Coretta. I'm not sure, but the design was probably by a local artist, and the pots holding artificial flowers looked freshly made. Next to that was the tomb of the unknown slave. We've grown, somewhat tattered, but striking in its simple offerings of art and mementos. And the front is a pair of old marching boots. I don't know if you can see them, but marching boots that I kind of wondered who wore them. It could have been one of the marchers from Montgomery. It could have been Sheriff Crawford that years before this. But the symbolism of those were really striking. And there were many simple offerings of art and mementos. And the peace sign, the painted bottles that held bouquets, and a child's toy soldier there in the little blue pants, and a teddy bear were probably dedications made in the last couple of years. I was especially struck by the Cuban Santeria drum hung on the wrought iron tombstone on the left. Having seen the same instrument played in Cuban ceremonies, and wondered if a drummer had played at this site and made for donation afterwards. This small park needed maintenance and repair. It was well used and visited. And I talked to a woman who worked in a souvenir shop right next door. She told me that there was absolutely no state or federal money applied to the site. It was all donations by the people of Selma. So a pathway led down from here to the river and the underside of the Pettus Bridge. I did not take detailed photos here, but I noted that the underside contained not only graffiti, peace signs, and folk art, but may have also been used as a homeless campsite and a meeting place for teenagers and fishermen. This little park also contained a memorial plaque dedicated to two mothers of the civil rights movement. First on the left is Amelia Boynton Robinson, and then Marie Foster. both of which I mentioned as key voting rights organizers and marchers on Bloody Sunday at the bridge. Robinson was the first Black woman to ever speak a congressional seat in Alabama and won 10% of the vote. This is she in 2015 on the Pettus Bridge with Barack Obama, Michelle, John Davis, and other notables of the original march, which was in 1965. She was 100 years old there, and she died shortly after that. I wish I had met her. Later, I learned more about Diane Nash, a co-founder of SNCC. She was well versed in the theory and practice of nonviolent movement, and said by John Lewis, a powerhouse of organizing prowess. As one of the first protesters in the anti-segregation movement, she refused bail and was incarcerated and sent a letter to the editor of the Rock Hill Evening Herald, the local newspaper, which is said to be the inspiration for Dr. King's famous letter from Birmingham jail. And King spoke of Nash with thanks for her demonstrative courage and faith. I can share more about this woman during our question and answer period, so I'll leave the details for that. I'd like to say that our short visit to Selma and the Pettus Bridge has already had a profound impact on my learning journey, and as an old teacher, I'll continue sharing what I can about the important effects that Selma's activists have and will continue to have on all of our lives. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Daryl Fisher, who is joining us virtually.
And thank you, Barbara and Momentum Center staff for bringing me in remotely. Even though we have been back from our road trip for a couple months, it's still very vivid in my memory. So eager to share some of my reflections with you. And now we can go to the first slide, Barbara.
So now let me refine where we were there.
You're amazing. This is
Yeah,
tricky. There we
The
go.
next one. Yep.
Yep, just do that. Okay, Daryl, go and take it from here.
Okay, let's have the next slide. So here we are looking at the Pettus Bridge. And we walked across this on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in April and boarded the bus to drive 51 miles to Montgomery, our next destination. Can we see the next slide, Barbara?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're seeing, Daryl, but we were on the Pettus
Slide
Bridge, and
19
now
of the
we're
bridge.
yeah, we did the bridge, and then I moved to the next photo.
Okay, sorry, I'm seeing something different, but that's okay.
Oh, okay.
So as we boarded the bus, I was reminded of a quote by Senator and Reverend Raphael Warnock of Georgia. He says, "America is a freedom caravan. Freedom is not a destination, it's a journey." And our journey was very different from the freedom marchers who crossed this bridge on what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. The next slide is a photo from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, which shows marchers attempting to cross the bridge on March 7th, 1965. On the first of 3 marches, John Lewis and hundreds of others were beaten by officers as they tried to cross the Alabama River. It took 2 more attempts to reach the state capitol. But by the time they reached Montgomery 2.5 weeks later, on Thursday, March 25th, they were 25,000 strong. There's one more photo that I'd like to share from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. This shows mile 51.4. The marchers walked every step of the way from Selma to the Capitol, covering about 12 miles a day and sleeping in farmers' fields along the way. Now today, at the intersection in front of the Capitol, there are hundreds of footprints in all sizes and shapes. And as I waited for the light to change, I could see everything from sturdy work boots to men's dress shoes and women's high heel shoes. Imagine doing that walk in heels, just symbolizing the determination of the marchers. A few blocks away is a life-size sculpture of Rosa Parks, who was arrested on a Montgomery bus on December 1st, 1955, for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. This sparked the bus boycott that we've all heard about, in which thousands of people walked to work for over a year. The sculpture is located on the block where Mrs. Parks worked as a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store. I was surprised to learn that it was dedicated on December 1st, 2019, just 2.5 years ago. And right next to this sculpture is this plaque in the sidewalk with this quote from Mrs. Parks. So her goal was certainly accomplished as the first woman to lie in state at the US Capitol. So this was my second trip to Montgomery, the first being in December of 2019, the same time that dedication of the Rosa Parks sculpture was made. This was the year that the Equal Justice Initiative opened two groundbreaking sites, the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. I was a museum consultant for 3 decades, and my first pilgrimage was with a group of 16 colleagues who had traveled from all over the United States to see these new EJI sites that were literally rocking the museum world. During our 3-day visit, we had the amazing good fortune to be able to spend a morning with Bryan Stevenson. Many of you might know him as not only the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, but the author of Just Mercy. You know, there are some people who can change your life simply by being in their presence. And Bryan Stevenson is one of those. He is just the most patient, persistent, wise, humble, compassionate human being I have ever had the privilege of meeting. So the next photo is of the original Legacy Museum that, as I say, opened in 2019. I have worked with scores of museums in my career, and I visited many more, but I have never been as moved as I was when I visited this modest-looking building that housed the first Legacy Museum. Maybe it's because it was conceived, planned, and executed by EJI staff members. So these practicing attorneys were steeped in the lives of the clients they defended every day, but they had no previous experience designing museums or memorials. So I see the Legacy Museum as a prime example of the brilliance of beginner's mind. Bryan told us that he and his team began working with a well-respected national museum design firm, but after 6 months, he said he knew he had to let them go. And he said humbly, I realized we didn't know what we were doing, but we had a vision that was based on decades of experience, working with prisoners and their families to overcome a system of modern day enslavement. Now let's look at the photo of the new Legacy Museum. What a contrast, huh? There are 2 things that amazed me on my second trip. The first was the sheer size and scope of this new museum that was created in less than 3 years while Brian and his staff continued to seek justice for clients on death row. So they designed, funded without any government money, built and opened a new museum that's 4 times larger than the first one. And the second thing that surprised me is that none of their brilliant innovations from the initial museum, were lost in translation to this huge new site. So here are a few of those new exhibits that I just wanted to share with you. Are we looking at the hologram now?
We are now.
Okay, cool. So when we stood in front of the cells of jailed slaves, their images would come into focus and we could hear their voices speaking to us. We could hear a mother singing, "They sold my children and I wish I never was born." We could hear 2 young children, a sister who was slightly taller than her younger brother, calling, "Mama, Mama." It was, I guess you had to be there to experience this. Then another of the early exhibits that they continued was the Community Remembrance Project, which is shown in these jars, hundreds of jars of soil. People were invited to go to sites where racial terror lynchings had taken place and to gather soil to honor the lives of those lost. And the number of jars that are here, the variety of colors of soil, it all hints at the unique stories represented by each and every jar. Another early exhibit that they maintained was one that let us get to know inmates in 2 ways. First of all, they had letters and emails that incarcerated people had written to Brian and his staff. And then they also had these really basic tables where we could sit down, pick up a phone, and have conversations with inmates like this woman. It was a one-way conversation. It wasn't as if we could ask them questions, but it was pretty realistic to be sitting there and holding that phone. And then this next photo just highlights that tagline of the Legacy Museum, because I never really understood I wasn't really clear about the legacy of what. And then when you see it's from slavery to mass incarceration, it became clear to me that there are all these continuing aspects of racism in contemporary America. You know, everything from the fact that Blacks, who make up 13% of the US population, account for 40% of our prison population, to the ever-growing efforts to restrict the vote of people of color. So those are all part of the legacy of slavery. In Brian's words, while slavery has been outlawed, it has continued to evolve. Some new things, which we can't show you, I couldn't take photos in the new building, are these dramatic, large-scale audio visuals of powerful events like the transatlantic voyages of the slave ships that are known as the Middle Passage. I will never forget the experience we had when we walked through a dark passageway into a room with the largest screen I have ever seen in an exhibit and heard the sounds of waves crashing from floor to ceiling and the sights of these waves that seemed like they were just washing over us. It was so poignant that it literally took my breath away. So from there, we went into the next gallery and saw scores of these sculptural busts of people of all ages, everything from young children like those we see here to elderly people, all just clawing their way ashore on a sandy beach. Brian had told us that he wanted to create a narrative museum. And by that, he meant a museum that tells stories, because he knew that we remember stories much more than we remember facts. So throughout the museum are works of art, particularly sculptures like this one, that tell stories that words could only hint at. And these works are all combined with words to illustrate the inhumanity of racism. Like in this page from an auction catalog. I mean, the way that human beings were marketed is mind-blowing. And this photo of male and female slaves at auction. So after spending 3 hours in the museum, I, for one, wished that I'd had more time, but many of us were glad to sit down together over authentic Southern cuisine from Panny George's Kitchen, which is a restaurant in Auburn that Brian and his colleagues got to know while they were representing clients on death row. So he brought this restaurant to the Legacy Museum, and now they have this flagship site there. So for all of this progress, it just never stops happening at EJI. As we walked from our hotel to the new museum that morning, we passed this huge construction site, and it was a full block immediately adjacent to the museum. So my thought was, oh no, this is going to be some massive commercial project that will overshadow the Legacy Museum. But I needn't have worried, because that afternoon, when we talked to an EJI staff member at the National Memorial, we learned that it will be an outdoor plaza for rest, reflection, and gathering of people who visit the museum. And it's supposed to open this summer. So just a couple other sites before leaving the Legacy Museum. This is the reflecting pool outside of Panny George's restaurant. Although these are amazing sites, I don't think they're meant to be celebratory reflections of racial progress, but to challenge us to see that racism is still our nation's greatest sin. Brian Stevenson believes that truth and reconciliation are sequential. Those words just keep reverberating in my mind, and means that truth has to come first, which makes me think that we all can be more courageous in telling the honest truth about racism in our city, our state, our nation, in our homes, and our schools, and our places of business. So just want to end with one more picture of Brian. Here he is with Walter McMillan, who some of you may remember as a main character in Just Mercy, the movie, and who, after he was released from prison, worked with Brian and the EJI for many years. I'll never forget what Brian challenged me and my museum colleagues to do that day in 2019. He said, we all need to be willing to step up, to be proximate with injustice, and to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations if we want to make a difference. And now Betsy is going to talk to you about the second EJI site, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice.
Do I have to do something to turn this?
It's just too low.
The volume is not working. Yeah.
And did you want me to advance your slides?
Okay, I haven't used one of these before. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
All right. I'd like to begin by saying that Cindy Anderson has done a masterful job of describing the emotional impact of our trip. You can watch it on the C3 Facebook website. Go to c3westmichigan.org. Our task today is different than Cindy's. Rather than trying to express the emotional impact of the trip, we want to give you some idea of what you will see if you sign up at the Momentum Center for the next Civil Rights Immersive Trip. That said, there's no way to separate the emotional impact. I mean, it's just, as you can tell, it's just there. So far, you've heard about the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, the Pettus Bridge, and the Legacy Museum, which has single-handedly made the nation confront its violent racial past. When it debuted in 2018, mentioning racial violence like lynching was still taboo. I want to describe what is across the street from the Legacy Museum, the 6-acre outdoor memorial called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The memorial is part of the museum complex created by attorney Brian Stevenson, whom Daryl has just told us a lot about. He founded the Equal Justice Initiative, wrote Just Mercy, which is made into a film. The total museum complex is amazing. My focus is on the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the design of which was inspired by South Africa's Apartheid Museum and Germany's Holocaust Memorial. The memorial not only focuses on the legacy of racial terror lynchings, racial segregation, and Jim Crow, but also includes present issues of guilt and police violence. Memorial is organized in 3 different sections. First section is a sculpture-lined path that along the way tells of the so-called Middle Passage, enslaved African Americans transported by ship from Africa to America, chained together, unable to use the toilet for roughly 80 days. It's estimated that 1 in 6 died en route. Along the path is a sculpture by Ghanaian artist Kwame Akoto Bamfo. It's of 7 shackled figures of all ages and genders interlocked together, part of a larger project to preserve memories of formerly enslaved people. In the Middle Passage, people were stripped of their African identity through the loss of names, ethnic identity, families, and more. The Nkimkim sculptures include descriptions and details of each shackled person portrayed. Akoto Bamfo's sculptures aim to return these identities symbolically, giving them backgrounds ranging from daughter of a royal to uncle's brother to the lost guardian. American artist Dana King's Guided by Justice sculpture is a rendering of the Montgomery bus boycott during the Civil Rights Movement. It depicts 3 women, a grandmother, a teacher, and a pregnant woman. There are footprints on the ground near the 3 people, representing a call to action for others to join them in the cause. King's sculpture also aims to have viewers reconsider the mythology of heroines of the bus boycott. Mythologizing historical figures like Rosa Parks draws away attention from the thousands of other Black people who were central in the success of the bus boycott. The 3 anonymous figures and the adjacent footprints demonstrate the importance of these silent activists. The journey through the memorial continues with Hank Willis Thomas's sculpture, Raise Up, a depiction of policing in America. The sculpture depicts 10 Black men encased in concrete, some with their heads sunken into the concrete, hands up and eyes closed. Cultural studies scholar Tanya Schultz saw Thomas's sculpture as a powerful evocation of the reality of Black men in America when coming face to face with law enforcement. Thomas, interestingly, encases these Black men in concrete, leaving them unable to move. Some figures' heads are sunken in as well, further demonstrating the lack of control and autonomy Black people have over their bodies. Though most of their bodies are covered, their hands are clearly visible, referencing the many stories of unarmed Black men being shot and brutalized by the police despite their innocence. The National Memorial uses Thomas's sculpture as a connection to the present, a kind of call to action that the fight for justice and liberation is ongoing. After the sculptures, visitors continue up a gravel path to the second section of the memorial, which consists of 805 hanging steel rectangles, the size and shape of coffins. The beams look like a forest of hanging bodies, and the replica beams off to the side look like rows of coffins. Each marker represents a county or jurisdiction that experienced a lynching between 1877 and 1950. On the boxes, you'll find the names and dates of forgotten victims, like Henry Smith of Lamar County, Texas. This young man was accused of killing a white girl and then hanged and maimed in front of a crowd of 10,000. Or there's Elizabeth Lawrence, lynched in Birmingham, Alabama in 1933, after she scolded children for throwing rocks. The memorial recounts these details in brief side panels. The markers hang at eye level, but as visitors proceed through the monument, the floor slopes down. Soon the monuments are suspended above, forcing one to look up. Eventually, hundreds of slabs hang ahead like bodies. A visitor becomes the spectator, like those that came out to watch the lynchings, bearing witness to brutality. To me, the stories I read, as well as the experience of going through the monuments, are deeply thought-provoking, painful, and heart-wrenching. The third section of the memorial is a reflection space, place for much needed rest and deliberation in honor of Ida B. Wells. And it is called to action. Wait, I'm sorry. I redid at the last minute. For me, this trip has been a profoundly moving, eye-opening experience. I can think of no better way to learn firsthand about an extremely important time in our nation's history, the effects of which are still being felt today. And it is a call to action. I truly believe that the most powerful weapon on earth is the human soul on fire. And now I'd like to introduce Carrie Corpy, who will talk to you about Memphis.
My little find from Memphis on the board here. Whoops, sorry. Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the last part of our journey. First, I'd like to begin with the Civil Rights Road Trip really opened my eyes to new beginnings. And sometimes things happen in your life along your journey that you that need to happen. And this was one of those trips. I saw the world and the issues that we faced in history and that we face today with new eyes. I now look at our world with through two lenses. One is the lens of love and the other is the lens of fear, which basically turns into hate for others. When people stir fear into the hearts of others, negative biases expand and they become hateful. When people, we end up protecting ourselves instead of reaching out and helping each other because we are afraid of something. And it's usually that one wants to hold on to some form of power. But Dr. King reached out. He fought with love and justice for all people. And nonviolence was his way. I believe Dr. King looked through two lenses also, and he chose to look through the lens of love in order to make progress toward his human goal, which was to begin to dispel the myth that Black people are inferior. I will forever applaud Dr. King for using his heart combined with his sound judgment as he lived to help others. He famously said, which Jane quoted, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Oh, there he is. I won't swear, but because my grandson's in the audience, but down here we make our own laws. I'm glad I was alive at that time, but I'm glad I didn't have to live under that. I believe we can all do our part to confront the injustices that are in our world today. And instead of tearing each other down, we don't want to go back to this time. On our final stop of our civil rights bus trip, we toured the famous Lorraine Motel, and it still boasts its 1950s vintage sign on the outside. It was here where Dr. King spent his final night of his life on Earth on April 3rd, 1968, after giving his famous mountaintop speech. And in this speech, he spoke at the Mason Temple Church, which we also visited. And I have to show you how fun our group is. Jade is here today. And that was a lot of, I mean, we all had a really good time. That was 54 years ago that he gave that speech. At the Lorraine Motel, we saw the actual motel room, staged how it was that Sunday, the balcony where Dr. King was shot, and we toured the building across the street from there where James Earl Ray supposedly shot Dr. King from, although there's much speculation still about that. This really made an impact on me. You know, it's have to tell someone that you are a man too. The Lorraine Motel was built in 1925 and served as a motel for Black people, Black travelers, and it's in the Green Book too, which shows they carried this along with them so they could know where they could actually stay and eat and everything. And now it's home to the National Civil Rights Museum, which is the first civil rights museum in America. In 1992, the museum, let's see if I have that one next. Yeah. In 1992, the museum began collecting historical data, objects, images, and documents. It was renovated and reopened in 2014, so it's fairly new also. The Ford Motor Company was a major donor for this museum. It was given the honor in 2016 as becoming a Smithsonian affiliate museum, which was quite amazing. It houses 260 different artifacts to look at, 40 up-to-date films, oral histories, and interactive media that guide you through time-sequenced exhibits showing American history from the 1600s to present day. It also receives kudos from all of us for their gift shop. Let's see, the exhibit that I found most interesting, and I've always been interested in this since I was little, is the student sit-ins, which first happened in 1960 in Nashville. The Nashville Student Movement was a student organization that challenged racial segregation. They were considered the most effective movements of 1960, and then they gave rise to the Freedom Rides in 1961 that Jane talked about. This exhibit reminded me of watching the civil rights riots on television when I was a young girl. I couldn't believe what my eyes were looking at on the TV. and police and white people just fighting the Black people for no justified reason other than nonviolent marches. Here's another one. And so in this museum, they have some of the original diner seats and the countertops they collected. And behind there, old historical newsreels show what happened when the people of color sat down at the white-only counters. With these historical reels playing in the background, it showed such hate emanating from people's faces. They were also angry as they pulled the Black people off their stools and basically threw them out of the diner. Once in a while, you'd see a white person assisting, and I wondered with each exhibit, what would have I done? Would have I sat down side by side or have done nothing? While watching this exhibit, there was a Black woman and her husband next to me, and we started a conversation. I told her I was sorry for the events that have happened to people of color, and she understood that it was not our fault, but that we do need to continue to fight for progress. She also asked me, this is a quote that I really love, because it goes all the way from, you know, people to the Supreme Court, to the Constitution, to God Almighty. These words really spoke to me. She asked me if I knew about the talk that they have to have with their children as soon as they're independent. And I did know about the talk because we learned about it in our Momentum Center town halls on racism. And I replied that I was so sorry that had to be a part of their life. Most all of the Black families, that has to be a part of their life before their teenagers go out into the world. Other exhibits included the Montgomery bus boycott, which you actually got onto a bus and you heard Rosa Parks' story. And that was really neat. And in her words, I could just feel her quote that she said, "The only tired I was tired of giving in." So she couldn't stand it anymore. I'd like to get back to Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta. Do they look tired? Yeah, they were tired. The next quote shows what he said about that. "I'm tired of getting hit, tired of being beaten, tired of going to jail. But the important thing is not how tired I am. The important thing is to get rid of the conditions that lead us to march." As you can see, the Lorraine Motel, the National Civil Rights Museum inside of it, is a worthy destination, filled with historical facts and emotional artifacts. I highly recommend this Civil Rights Road Trip to all of you who want to learn, understand, and witness our true American history, the good and the bad. May we all use the lens of love to see and understand each other more deeply. Thank you. And now Cindy Anderson. Follow you.
Oh, well, you can understand why the whole trip had this big knot right here, just a big knot of emotion at all times. And you can also understand why it was a trip of a lifetime for me, shared with people filled with so much love and such big hearts. So I'm going to tell you, my job is to tidy this up, tell you a few other things about the trip, but you've already heard almost everything I'm going to say through the hearts and the eyes of some really amazing people who taught me a lot on the trip. Each of the 40 of us on the trip had different reasons for going. As far as me, 2 of my close friends, Daryl and Jane, were the planners, and my idol, Barbara, was the leader of this trip. So I thought, wow, I've always had curiosity about this. This is the trip to join. I knew it would be amazing, and it was amazing. Back in my high school and college days, the news was filled with civil rights marchers and riots and stories on TV. And I remember exactly where I was my senior year of high school, the night Martin Luther King was killed. I remember what happened in my town, and I was really amazed by all of it and very puzzled by all of it, how it could have gotten so awful. During my college years, in the late 60s and 70s, much to my parents' distress, I did a lot of sit-ins and protests and really stood up for the people that I knew in our country that needed some help. So I was proud of that part. And I enrolled in one of the very first race and culture classes at my university. And in my freshman year, and I read authors like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, Alex Haley and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So I felt like I had a little bit of background, but none of it prepared me for the amazing time on this trip. As a retiree, I've volunteered a lot of time with an organization called Humanity for Prisoners. And through that organization, I've learned a lot about the Jim Crow era, about mass incarceration. And I've read Brian Stevenson's work and other authors that we brought to town to talk to us about the situation of mass incarceration. But I wanted to learn more. So I signed up for the trip. And of course, Barbara had a suggested reading list, and there are several of them floating around if you'd like to see them. I'm supposed to be doing this. Oh yeah. Oh, these are my buddies that were on the trip with me. You can see us on the bridge there. And that was a very powerful moment. I'm not so far behind.
Nope.
These are the books that I looked at before we went, and they're significant to me because they really helped me see the organizations, the facilities that we visited and the museums. They really helped me understand some of the background, and a couple of them I want you to, I'll tell you a story later, but one of them is the White Fragility book. It had a passage in it that played into a conversation I had at one of the museums. Where am I now? All of it was important reading, but none of it, again, prepared me for the beauty of this. And this is something that I think we all need to put in our pocket, that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I think that's written on the side of the museum. I think it's in the museum, and I just think we all need to memorize that. There are a lot of people right now in our country fighting the need for us to learn the history of enslavement and racism in this country, but until we do totally understand the history of our country will never heal. Our bus trip was interesting. We had a lot of wonderful reflections and things, and Barbara didn't ever want us to rest. So even though we were traveling, we were also watching movies, and all of these movies were just really important to the trip. We started out with Just Mercy. I think the next one we watched was Hidden Figures. And then I Am Not Your Negro is really an interesting movie. It was hard to hear and see on the bus because it's filmed in a really dark way. And it's James Baldwin's notes about the murders of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, who were all friends of his. But he didn't finish those notes before he died. So the movie is pieces of all that. Very interesting. I want to watch it at home when I can hear it better. The Help, boy, we all watched The Help when it came out, but to see it again and really have lived through more history of the whole Jim Crow era, and it just makes the movie more powerful. One of my favorite movies on the trip was Son of the South, because it is one of the white guys who stepped up and helped his young Black friends in college to really make a difference. And he's still alive today. He's an attorney. and he still fights for civil rights. And then we ended the trip with the Black Panther, which was so appropriate because the Black Panther, you know, is a superhero, a Marvel superhero that came out a couple years ago, much to the delight of the African American community because they finally had a superhero of their color. And he not only was such a good guy to save his community, but he really saved the whole world. So I love that. And then I just can't remember where my notes are. I got off here. Okay, here we go. The Ida B. Wells quote, I think you also mentioned, somebody mentioned this, that you have to, you know, to right the wrongs, we have to look at them, we have to turn our eyes to them. And that's what this trip did for me. It put everything in the light so that I could really understand first how we got there and why we're still there. And I want to make sure that I do what I can, and the other people in our group feel this way too, that we need to do what we can to bring the truth to light. Some of the most powerful exhibits for me in the museums were the ones representing families being split up and sold away from one another. And this is when I'm going to tell you my story. This statue was in Memphis, and it broke my heart. But in the holograms in the Montgomery Museum, first of all, I read White Fragility. And in White Fragility, it says we have such a hard time talking about race when we're white people, and especially white women, because we get upset and cry. And then Black people have to comfort us, so they can't really tell us their stories. And so I'm just trying, I'm a crier. You all know that about me. And I had this giant crying lump in my throat the whole time I was on this trip. And I went to the hologram part of the EJI museum, and the last hologram is the little children holding each other and saying, "Mama, Mama." Now I got my mask on, tears are flowing, snot is running. I'm just like a mess. And this beautiful Black woman who was like a docent there came up to me and put her arms around me and said, "Honey, do you need something?" And I said, "Well, you're not supposed to be helping me because I was, you have a Kleenex." And then she gave me a Kleenex, and I felt so guilty, but so much better. Anyway, that was the other impression from the trip, that the grace and the kindness and the welcoming souls that we met in these museums, they just could not have been more open to all of us. And I think that's a remarkable characteristic. Let's see. The jars, they just break your heart, but they also make you so glad that finally some of these people who experienced racial terrorist lynchings were named. They were named, and their families have a chance to come and honor them in a place. And there's a great story that went around about these people have to be pretty brave to go out into these fields and dig up places where they know family members were lynched. Many of the fields are still owned by white people, and probably white people who are descendants of people who enslaved their family, or at least were part of. Anyway, there's a great story about a woman who was out digging, kind of nervous about digging. And the farmer came out and said, "What are you doing here?" And she thought, "I'm in big trouble." And she told him what the project was. And he got down on his knees and dug with her. And the jar sits in the museum now. It's a very powerful exhibit. This monument memorializes all the hangings and the beatings and the drownings of people that were not named. They've still not been named anywhere. There are 80, let's see, 4,400.
4,400 with 2 documented pieces.
Yeah, 4,400 people on those panels that were racial terrorist hung. And this monument is to the thousands that they couldn't document yet. So it's only the tip of the iceberg. And in the Lorraine Museum, there was this section about how the wealth of the South was created on those backs of Black people. And several, I didn't put them all in, but they would talk about how many pounds of tobacco per year an enslaved person would produce and what that monetized for the white owners. And that was really powerful to me to think about how much wealth of this country was built on the backs of our enslaved brothers and sisters. But probably what struck me the most about this trip, I mentioned it a little bit, was the grace and the beauty of the people around us, but also after 400 years of slavery, of 12 generations of slavery, the kidnapping of people from Africa, the horrendous conditions of their transport, the greed of their enslavers, the brutality of their overseers, the terror and humiliation of the Jim Crow era, their continual and ongoing fight for equality and justice. What strikes me the most is the resilience of these people, how they persevered through the brutality, how they fostered hope, but fostered hope of freedom for 12 generations. I don't even know what my family was doing 12 generations ago. How they continued to create music and a culture of love. And once they were granted their freedom, how they peacefully resisted the hateful prejudice which kept them from full citizenship, and how they patiently worked toward equality. And even today, how they continue to work for a better future for all of us. There's hope in this, and I wanted you to read this one. This is in the Birmingham Museum, that even with the negativity in the past, that they're hoping for a bright tomorrow. And upon our return, all 40 of us knew we were changed, and all 40 of us knew there was work to be done. We made a list of actions so we could continue. We want to continue to learn about racism in these United States and our parts in it. We want to learn to be allies to our Black brothers and sisters. We want to learn to support the work for equality and justice for all humans. So here we are talking to you. This is one of our action points. We're doing it tonight. And we hope to talk with many other people. We hope you talk with other people. And as we speak, there are people in this country attempting to suppress the hard-earned votes of African Americans, of all people of color. It's almost unbelievable that the issues we protested in the 70s, we need to fight for again. So please vote. Join us in working to make our country what it was meant to be. And please take a civil rights road trip of your own. If you don't do it with Barbara, do it. It is so worth it, and it will change your life. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Yeah, think about the questions you might have, and if maybe speakers can come over up here. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank you for being here. Can we get a round of applause? Wonderful, wonderful sharing. And as Cindy said, there are opportunities. We are putting together the next civil rights road trip for the fall. It'll be late October or early November, finalizing dates right now. Make sure there's a sign-up sheet for the newsletter. If you want that information, make sure that you sign that up. And let us know if you're interested in being on that bus. I want to close with a very short reflection from Margaret Halsey in 1946. Who said one of the less dismaying aspects of race relations in the United States is that our improvement is not a matter of a few people having a great deal of courage. It is a matter of a great many people having just a little courage. May we all have that kind of courage.